Welcome, everyone. This is the newest episode of the Art Block podcast. We are obviously not doing the usual setup. Abraham isn't here today, and I'm joined by one of our past attendees or past guests on the podcast, Luis Blackaller, my tocayo. And really, today is more kind of I guess I'd describe it as like a more basic episode, a little bit more of a relaxed, fun. Definitely want to talk to you about your work on our cover for the new zine, which if you have not submitted yet, definitely submit before May 31st of 2024. But, ¿qué onda, tocayo? How have you been?
Pretty good, pretty good. Yeah, this feels definitely a lot more casual. We're here in a hamburger giant, somewhere in Highland Park, Figueroa and York or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
We definitely miss Abraham. That's gonna be, definitely would have been good to get into some discussions with him about the subject matter, which I think is very cool to all of us. Because, we start talking about this recent series of covers that you invited me to contribute to in the Art Block Zine number 9, and the subject matter, the good and evil kind of theme. I mean, it's a very human topic that we all have something to say about it, right?
Yeah.
It has to do with ethics and morality, all those kinds of things, and also, which is kind of what interested me when trying to think about what to do for these illustrations. There are different angles and the different approaches in which different cultural backgrounds they take a look at the subject matter. Tocayo, when you invited me to make these illustrations, something that you said that resonated a lot to me was you said good/evil. You didn't say good and evil or good versus evil, right? And that got me thinking because, I think when you look at good and evil from the perspective of, I don't know, probably the mostly Christian American popular culture, there's a very clear divide, right? The good guys and the bad guys, and they're always fighting, and the good guys always win unless it's a horror movie, which is when the bad guys win, but it's always a disaster. In that sense, there's always this conflict that needs a resolution, and there's no potential for gray areas. It's very black and white, right? You're the good guys, you're the bad guys, period. And that's different in many other, cultural settings. I am from Mexico, and I think we have a lot more nuanced or mixed up perspective around the whole thing, right? Like you don't really. I mean, the good versus evil thing, of course, it's there, and like the angels and demons kind of thing. It's like the Catholic tradition has it as well.
Yeah.
But we also have the pre-Hispanic, the Mesoamerican cultural influence, in which more like it was the case in the, for example, Greek mythologies, there's no clear definition of good and evil, right? Like gods and goddesses and like deities and all that. They all had, more like us, a mixture of behaviors in which you could be good and bad at the same time, and it would be very difficult to, determine exactly whether you are like a good person or a bad person. And it's more like a contextualized and circumstantial kind of thing. And it made me think about some stuff I grew up with, for example, like the lucha libre stuff, right? Which has that good versus evil kind of thing. You got the technicos,
Yeah,
which
the
is
rudos.
the guys that play fair, and the udos, which is the guys that are cheating, right?
Yeah.
And then you get this crazy thing where, like, you know, the most popular lucha libre luchador in history, which is El Santo. I mean, his name says it all. He's the saint,
Yeah.
right? But he was a rudo, right? So,
Yeah.
like, the saint was a bad guy, like a cheater. So
Yeah.
it's very interesting how it's kind of like you're able to kind of like just realize that rather than being this or that, it's just it's more like probably thinking about the balance of what these things are. So I kind of like took that approach to that, and then looked at the tradition in popular culture of comic books and historietas to use it as a source of inspiration for a composition that could allow me to take some characters that I have been playing with for a while under some circumstances that would illustrate this idea. And well, you guys gotta see them to understand what I'm talking about. Probably I'm not gonna spoil them too much. But yeah, I mean, maybe that was a pretty long introduction.
No, but I think that that's very appropriate to the like concept, right, of the zine, no? Because I remember, and I've been saying this the several times that I've talked about the theme. You know, it's not good versus evil. It's not good over evil. It's just good slash evil. Como si fuera una dicotomía, no? And it's obviously never going to be that way. You know, that's not the reality of those concepts. But, you know, I wanted to challenge people to see what their interpretation was of that, to see how much on the spectrum people would identify with the concept, with the theme. And I really appreciated our couple of times that we met where you were showing me your sketches and your concepts. And one of the things that I thought was really cool was that you were drawing inspiration from the historietas from like que los 60s, 70s, por ahí.
That's right.
And, you know, those I think, you know, they have a different style and a different, not just visual look, but like storytelling style, you know? Especially when you compare them to like current day American comics, you know. You're obviously talking about cultural differences, but even just the way that a hero is portrayed. And I was wondering, you know, what are your sort of takeaways from looking at those comics of the 80s, 70s, and, you know, thinking about the evolution even of the comic book as a storytelling kind of mode or format?
Yeah, well, there's obviously a nostalgic element to that because I grew up in a world where like the screens did not exist yet the way we know them today. Like, you know, popular culture and mass media were mostly consumed through radio, television, and printed media. Some cinema, right? Of course. But computer screens have yet not invaded our private lives, and forget about the, you know, phones and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So there's a nostalgia to that, but also an interest that I always had about thinking of this, you know, since the emergence of mass media, when the printing press was invented hundreds of years ago, we, over the centuries, have grown accustomed to leaving the company of what you could call disposable media, right? Stuff that entertainment, stuff that you consume to go through your day, right? It's not like like deep reading or anything. It's stuff you look at now. And today we do it with our phones. Like most of what we get in that sense is in our phones. We do some computer, we do some TV. some of us still go to the movies, but it has changed a lot. There's still radio, now there's podcasts, but it's all in these devices. And if you go a few decades back when I grew up, uh, printed media was really the most accessible to people, at least in the environment where I was, which is Mexico City. And you had all this, I think it's for a reason that there were a lot of publications that were printed and bound and exactly the same size as a mobile phone. And this is because it's stuff that you can just put in your pocket and carry around with yourself. And if you're, in line working to, that was a time where you would have to go to the bank and you would have to go to the post. Like you would have to do a lot of things that you don't do anymore because you do it all in the computer. But there was a lot of waiting for the bus, all those kinds of things. Well, today you look at your phone, but back then you would take out your little publication, and a lot of them were historietas. So I think that made them very different kind of sorts of, I guess, genres than it is today, right? Because you would have to serve different kinds of public with these things, and I don't know exactly how it was in the U.S. In the U.S., there were the superhero comics, and there were things like Archie comics, and you did have your joke books and stuff like that with mature humor for adults and stuff like that. And it was similarly in Mexico in the sense that you had different types of publications for different groups of people, like for kids or for working class men, for working class women. It was very gender divided, right? You get adventure books for men and melodrama romance for women. There's still some of that today, right? Even though the gender boundaries have been crossed a lot. But I think when it was produced in such a scale and with the techniques that were available back then to do it, it had to be done in a different way than it happens now after computers changed the way we make illustrations, the way we print books. Sometimes they are not even printed anymore. And the fact that comic books, especially in America, they became, or the US, if you want to call it that way, the real name, they became a very niche kind of genre for people that were looking for the specific thing that they are now, right? Instead of being something that you would go to the grocery store and you see it in a display wall with a bunch of magazines, and a kid would be attracted to it and get it. Now somebody has to go to the comic book store and look for what he was expecting to, how or she or they were expecting to get, and just pick that up, right? Magazine stands have disappeared as well, so it's, and there's been a big change that I think also changes how the stories get made. You look at superhero stories today, they are way more aware at this, looking at good and evil as parts of a whole that's always, moving in motion, like a more yin-yang kind of thing, than back in the day when they were clearly, were the good guys, were the bad guys, right? Like heroes become villains and villains become heroes, and there's a story arc of redemption and things like that. So in that regard, some of the stories have become way deeper and more interesting, but they have lost some of that naivete that was very attractive back then. So I don't know, I rambled a little, I think, but there's some thoughts around that.
No, but I think that those are, important points because everything, especially because, cinema, you mentioned it before, right? It's changed a lot. Going to the movies isn't really about going and seeing somebody make a film about real life. Most of it now is, intellectual properties that are adapted into something, and a lot of them, especially in the last 20 years, have been focused on the comic book genre, right? We see, obviously the Marvel Cinematic Universe and DC trying to do their own thing. You know, those are the big ones. But you still see other comic books that are getting adapted or graphic novels. No, and I'm curious. You know, as a person that is an illustrator, as a person that creates within even the cinema field. Like, what are your thoughts on that, and the storytelling that is either being compromised or being celebrated? What are your general ideas
Well,
there?
that's a very tricky space to think about because there's so many ways to get into that subject matter that will take you to different discussions, right? Yeah, there's a executive tendency on the part of the studios today to risk as little as possible, take advantage of the nostalgia factor, and also protect themselves from having to share too much of the intellectual property rights with creators that inspires them to just go and just repeat from what has been done before. And comic books, just like books, by the way, turn out to be like a great template and inspiration for making interesting films or TV shows or whatever. But the way they are used in this regard is so that total ownership of what has been created is still in the hands of the corporations that originally were able to, basically because of circumstances of the time, steal all the value from these creations from the people that actually created them, right? It's kind of like, I'll pay you, then you come up with this, and I owe all of it because I paid you. And the contracts were basically established like that. You're working as a creative, more as a creative employee to the company, and the company owns everything you come up with. And that's in perpetuity in some cases, although there's some rules that make it so that after a while, specific works kind of fall into the public domain. Like it just happened with the original first iteration of Mickey Mouse, but later iterations of Mickey Mouse still are under the protection of the copyright because it takes I don't know how many, it's almost 100 years for it to expire, right? But on the other hand, if you're an author, whether it is books or comic books, and you are able to put out there your own creations in a way that you retain control over their copyright, and you're able to license the printed version of it to some publisher for a number of decades or whatever you want to do, and you could still retain some of that control over, so that if it's successful enough to interest a TV network or a film studio to make an adaptation, then you've got another deal with them and so forth, right? Things like Harry Potter are examples of that.
Yeah.
So there's that. And also, if you are more of a polymath that likes to move across different things, and you're able to write and draw and make animated movies or even films, you could in some ways be able to use one format or one medium to set up the grounds that could take you to work on another medium later on. People have done that sometimes. So it's very varied, and it's difficult to enter that kind of conversation and make somewhat properly bounded observations without having some kind of sense of the scope of what your conversation is to begin with, right? Like if we talk about this relationship between studios and commercial comic books, that's the conversation, right? But if you talk about the relationship that specific creators could have with the different mediums, that's a different conversation.
Right.
It's very interesting. I mean, the comic book thing in the movies, from the commercial angle, the studios and the superhero stuff and all that, it took a very long time to actually consolidate, and now it's kind of, you know, it's kind of like it's now going down a little. Some film theorists look at it from like the history of film kind of perspective, and I read something somewhere, I don't even know where it was, so I can't really properly quote it, but they were comparing the rise and fall of the Western genre with what is happening with the superhero genre, and in a sense of like trying to see kind of like parallelisms and differences, and it does help understand that you know, Westerns for a while were like the thing, right? Like it lasted a long time.
Yeah.
And we look at like the last Westerns and what they were. It seems they were Western TV shows too, like Bonanza and stuff like that. So it was like an interesting thing to look at, and it's just the superhero thing itself is a thing to think about. But when you look at Mexican historietas, which is where I mostly borrow from as a source for inspiration, even though superheroes were there, there was kind of like, or there still is, but way less, like a different, like it's a completely different approach to the whole thing.
Yeah, the thing about like the Mexican historietas that I remember as a kid was that they were not exactly superheroes. You know, the luchador, even Calimán, you know, who had like,
Calimán.
you know, but Calimán I think is a perfect example. He was kind of a superhero, but he was still a human when it came down to it. Just a human that had developed his body and mind to a point that was superhuman. Why do you think that in more often than not in Mexican culture we had that compared to the US, where it was like Superman and Spider-Man, you know, and there's these external forces that change the human, or the human is actually not human?
Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question. We have Fantomas too. You know, both Calimán and Fantomas are similar to Batman in that sense, that they are just people. And Fantomas is very similar to Batman in the sense that he had his headquarters with assistants, and like he was like he had like some source of wealth that he used to kind of like pursue his quests, right? But the fundamentals of the like adventures are very different. I mean, Batman is just a
rich psychopath,
anarcho-libertarian capitalist, right? Like it's a far-right Republican that, you know, wants to take justice into his own hands and justifies vigilantism and all that kind of stuff. I mean, if you really want to look at him that way, like, I mean, at the end of the day, most superhero fantasies are somewhat metaphors of the American police or military intervention in one way or the other. You know, it's people that are able to inflict overwhelming force onto like others in a way. And the villains are just the ones that went off the rails, but they are basically the same. And when you look at culture that is not driven by, I guess, it's, you know, imperial desires, you know, this desire to save everyone else for something, and, you know, because of that, justify having more power than anyone else, that kind of thing, right? It's like, yeah, you want a Superman because you want to be God. You know, there's something there that is inherent to like an imperial culture. I mean, you know, that's somewhat rooted in like British science fiction and like, you know, Western European science fiction in general, that comes with like a particular philosophy of colonialism and all that, and the last frontier, all those kinds of things, right? If you look at like the idea of a hero in the context of a culture that
just doesn't have these aspirations because we are not there, you know.
Yeah.
And like then the heroes start to perform different roles, and that's I think what happens with these characters like the luchadores and Fantomas or Calimán, you know, they were fighting in many cases great peoples. The sources of inspiration came in many cases from the same places. You know, there's this gigantic trope in popular culture and generally literature that is basically originated in Eastern Europe and was brought to this continent by the gigantic migrations that took place during the like late 19th and early 20th century that basically brought to us things like, you know, ideas of vampires and like werewolves and all those kind of like mythologies that have that origin and like that kind of stories, and the way they were the way they were kind of like adopted by the U.S. popular culture in the comic books and the movies and the pulp narratives and all that was very different than the way they were adopted in Mexico. Like when you look at they became a big genre, which was the basically luchador monster movie, right? Comic book, and it's kind of like it's just very different. Yeah.
You know, I find it fascinating that pretty much all cultures share the same or very similar types of monsters, and you know, like Alicia loves the vampires, you know, and I think vampires are pretty cool too. Although there's always been something kind of cool to me about the werewolf and the concept of being able to change into an animal, and you know, in Mexica culture specifically. And even I think other Mesoamerican cultures, there's the idea of the Nahual.
Yeah.
No? And the Nahual now at least is kind of depicted as something scary, something that you need to avoid. But, or like here in the US, you see a lot of people calling it the skinwalker, you know, based on Navajo tradition and that kind of thing. But I don't know, I think that the Nahual, and I might be wrong, but I think the Nahual used to be kind of like a symbol of the connectedness that we have with nature. But I mean, what are your thoughts on the different ways in which cultures have adapted or maybe come to the same ideas about the like transformation of human to animal and vice versa?
Oh yeah, I mean that's yes. And the nature of cosmos, right? It's like cosmology sometimes, and that is very true. Like you know, the Mesoamerican cultures had the Mesoamerican cultures had a completely different relationship with life and death than the post-Renaissance like Western cultures that colonized the world did, right? And in that sense, where life and death were again understood as like aspects of a whole, right? It's like life, death are part of the same thing. You cannot think about death in terms of something that takes the life away from you, but as death in terms of something that is part of life, right? So it goes again to this understanding of certain things as binaries, as not opposites in conflict, but as parts of a bigger thing, right? And it has to do with that, and not just pre-Hispanic cultures, but other ones in which, I mean, the classic Greece is a good example of that, you know, the things are not, they started to be separated, but in a different way. And you look at East Asia stuff, I'm not an expert on many of these things, but you start to see things in which it's understood in that way, right? It's more of a, it's more of a flux of different parts of the same whatever than
things that are separate. But I think the Western Europeans have developed the tendency to look at all these other cultures as, and it's kind of like an Orientalist thing to do, if you want to look for a term for that, in which in order to believe and separate them from them and believe that they are better than the others, they turn all these notions of things that they can consider or like label as savage, as things more primitive, uncivilized, and then rather than understanding them, they turn them into monsters of their own that are understood differently. Maybe you can understand the monster as the other that you have to annihilate, like in a video game, or you can understand the monster as that part of yourself that you need to keep in a conversation with, so that your dark side is in harmony with your other side, right? That kind of thing. So it's, I think there's that, right? I think that's why the Nahual is looked at that way. That's how I think that the Aztec blood sacrifices were understood as the ultimate savagery, when like the, Judeo-Christian traditions are understood as sublime, even though they are as brutal as the other ones, right? It's just different ways of understanding our relationship with blood and death and sacrifice and all those things. So, yeah.
Right. I don't know, I think that it would be really interesting to see if at some point, our popular media begins to change in its execution of these things, because, I mean, like as an example, last night I watched the movie American Fiction, and it's poking fun at the way in which black books are marketed. It's very much a commentary or a satire on the way in which white people feel guilty about, the experience of African Americans, and how in the end they end up just reinforcing the stereotypes, because that's the type of popular media they gravitate towards. And so it's really cool to see that there are black authors and black directors and actors who are kind of satirizing that and kind of beginning, at least a little bit in my opinion, to change the way in which white people are consuming media. And I'm kind of waiting for the day that happens for Latinos, where, we're finally going to be represented as like doctors on US specifically popular media. Because, we see Latino doctors all the time in like Mexican media, but it's like, at what point do we finally step away from always the cholo and always the like recovered gang member stereotype, and finally become, I don't know, just a family?
Yeah, I mean, it's very underrepresented. It is crazy, right? Because the term Latino means many things. Yeah. And it, as a Latino, you can be white and black, and like indigenous, or a mix of all those. Yeah. You can be American, or you can be from like wherever else in Latin America. So like there's a diversity there that is like more than anything you can find anywhere else. But there's a sort of a cultural unity to it that is, to your point, not properly represented, and also oftentimes looked at with this Orientalist angle from popular culture, in which, the Latinos are wild, and but it's not that we're wild, we just know how to have fun better, that's all. But that was just a joke. No, the thing is, like, I think it will happen over time, and it's kind of like, the thing is, like, can you have Latino characters that are clearly Latino, but, and it's, I mean, and Asians and black people, Native Americans, African Americans, everybody is kind of like, I think, looking forward to this, in which you have a place in which not only you are able to make
the culture, right?
Yeah.
It's your self-expression that's poured out there, but also you're able to do it on your own terms, and you don't have to make the center of your story what white people want to see on it.
Yeah.
So that you are clearly Latino, but your stories can be about whatever, and your characters can be anything, and it's clearly Latino. There's no doubt about it, but you don't have to behave in any like stereotypical manner that makes you, you know.
Yeah.
I'm so mad at Breaking Bad, for example. Like, it's like the way Breaking Bad portrays the complexity of the white characters versus the one-dimensionality of the Mexican characters makes me so annoyed.
Yeah.
So annoyed. But like, I don't know. I think that's slowly changing, and I think I'm also interested in like. World where popular culture, that's probably not going to happen given the tendencies of the political arena in the world right now, but where popular culture actually is able to emerge up to the global arena from like more places other than the global north, right? It's like we are exposed to a lot of popular culture from the US, Japan, and Europe.
Yeah.
Period. And the internet kind of has changed that a little, but the necessary conditions for a healthy marketplace that allows us to consume stuff that comes from anywhere else, that allows other places to produce materials at a similar level of sophistication, it's just not there.
Yeah.
And there's Bollywood, there's things, but it'd be nice if like, there would be Bolivian animated movies that people around the world were interested in watching.
Yeah.
But,
Well, hopefully we'll get to that point.
yeah.
And I think that that's a good moment to say, make sure that you submit to Art Block Zine, especially Volume 9, which comes out this year in hopefully early July. The deadline for submission is May 31st, 2024. So get those submissions in now. And the theme, again, is good/evil. It's not good over evil. It's not good versus evil. It's just good/evil. And you can always learn more about that on our website at distillarts.org/artblockzine. So I think, with that, do you have anything you want to share with our audience? Any upcoming events or any upcoming projects that we should be checking out on your social feeds?
Yeah, that's before I go on that. Yeah, there's 2 weeks left for that, right?
Exactly.
Deadline.
Yep.
I finished my contribution on time, and maybe we'll promote it a little.
Oh, yeah.
Try to see if it inspires anyone.
I hope so.
And
I'm sure it will.
yeah, maybe I'll do something extra. I don't know. Well, I am working on a series of prints that are very large, that are inspired by the impact of climate change and supply chains, but that sounds, I know, weird, and I'm taking a perspective that's very lyrical, in which it's just kind of like, imagine it as pictures of natural disasters that are represented by humanized forms of climate, so giants or kaijus, but with a touch of erotism, which makes it kind of weird. And I'm finishing that right now. I'm finishing a short film as well that I shot a long time ago, like 2.5 years ago or so.
Oh, okay.
I hope I can submit it to some festivals before the end of the year. I just have to finish the sound design.
Okay.
I just got the music score done, and that's a film about it's kind of like one of those sci-fi satires that looks at like issues with workers' rights in the gig economy, but it's taking this approach to think about what if there was something that was kind of like think of it as a combination of Netflix, Uber, and Instacart, but for lonely people or people in the need of attention, in which you could hire escorts on demand to perform family roles for you within storylines that you kind of like set up. And the story goes through some of that drama and how it becomes more and more difficult for people to tell between their performances and the real life, and also the issues that come with, gig economy under circumstances like that. So that's two things that I'm working on. And then my regular job, but that's another story.
All right. And where would people stay up to date with all these things that are coming up?
Well, there's cartoondistortion.com, which is where I put up all the projects, and then I have a Instagram account called cartoon-distortion. And it's the only one I use in terms of social media to put out stuff. I wish there was something better, but
It is what it is.
it is what it is for now. I don't have a Patreon or any of those things because it's too hard. I'd rather just be making art. I find it like, maybe it's because I'm old, it's very difficult to make stuff and promote it at the same time.
Yeah. No, yeah,
It's hard.
that's a whole job in itself.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And
But-
the talents, it takes a lot of skill.
Yeah, yeah. But, that's why we teach our professional development seminars. So you can always check those out on our YouTube channel too.
Yeah.
All right, Tocayo. Well, obviously it's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Working with you and having you on the podcast again. For sure, go check out his work on his website and also Instagram. And follow DSTL Arts at DSTL Arts on pretty much all the social media platforms. So thanks again, Tocayo.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. I will see y'all again later.